Have you ever wondered what happens after death? Deep hypnosis opens up the most amazing soul memories of a spirit world that awaits us all. Follow the fascinating journey of 15 ordinary people in the book Exploring the Eternal Soul who have been regressed beyond a past life into the afterlife.
Hello, welcome to the Spiritual Regression Show on moretalk.tv. My name is Rena, and I am the Director of Divine Aspect, a therapy practice based in Dorset, UK, focusing on life between life therapy, regression therapy, hypnotherapy, and life coaching. We are also joined today by Andy Tomlinson. Andy is the Director of the Past Life Regression Academy, and he trains regression therapists all over the world in Australia, Asia, Africa, Europe, and soon in the US. And he is also the author of 2 books, Exploring the Eternal Soul and Healing the Eternal Soul. We are also joined today by J.R. Reddy, a regression therapist and an LBL therapist based in London, UK. Jay and Andy, welcome to the show.
Hello, Rena.
Hello, Rena.
So Andy, could you just please start by perhaps explaining what life between life therapy is?
Well, this is a technique where people are able to discover what seem to be the soul memories between lives. They would be regressed into a past life, go through the death in that past life, and then allowed to continue all the way through to the point where they start the next past life. Or in the case of a past life, which is the very last one, then it would be in their reincarnation into their current life. But you know, sometimes people don't always have to be in very deep hypnosis to do that. Sometimes people spontaneously go into that. I remember a time when I was in Norway doing a demonstration of past life regression therapy to a group of 30 people, and the person who had volunteered to be the subject went into a past life where they were in the Brazilian jungle as an explorer and got an arrow and died. And the past life lasted for about 5 minutes, and I thought, oh, that was rather quick. What am I going to do? And strangely enough, as they went through the death point, I just allowed the story to continue and just simply said, and what happens next? And they described then being above the body, seeing the natives going around the body, and then being detached from it enough to be able to continue the journey, and then being reunited with this bright light that gave that particular soul a hug, and then feeling this immense sense of joy and bliss in the place that they're at. And I brought the other person back immediately out of that because it hadn't been my intention to do a life between life regression. And the person came out of that and they were just in a state of bliss. They were saying how amazing it was, how just connecting with these higher energies had such a profound effect on them. And, you know, sometimes this is what happens in these life between life regressions. This particular client went into spontaneous deep hypnosis, and I just allowed the story to continue.
Interesting. So can you just tell me, besides obviously it being a wonderful, blissful experience, how is undergoing a life between life session relevant for someone in their current life?
Well, normally people would come not particularly for that motive. I mean, that just happened to be that person's experience. Everybody will experience life between life regressions differently. But normally people come perhaps because they've read some of the material in the books and they're fascinated and want to have their own experience. Sometimes they may be stuck in the life and want to get a new insight to find out what the life is about, why they're here, what is being intended for them at a soul level to be doing in their life. So people can come in for a variety of reasons. But I think the one thing to point out, the difference between finding out about your life purpose through a life between life regression and perhaps being given this information, channeled perhaps by some psychic, is the difference between perhaps someone wanting to find out about romance and reading a book and actually having a romantic encounter with another person. That they're both romance, but when people are actually involved in it, it's so much more meaningful.
Jay, you experienced a life between life session, didn't you?
Yes, I have on a couple of occasions.
Oh, could you just tell me how the session went for you and how you benefited from it in your current life? How did it help you move forward in your current life?
It really helped me. I think I'd already done some past life work and current life work. So I was at a point where I felt I wanted to go beyond that and get a broader soul idea of my soul theme, what my soul is working on. And this was a way to do it. And for me, it created such a calmness and peace for me after the LBL. In my 2 LBLs, I actually went into the same LBL space between my last past life and this current life. But on both occasions I went into the LBL space, things were very, very relevant for that point in my life. So it was a very, very useful session for me. And it's interesting what Andy said about how you experience it. I found that the experience was on so many levels when the information was being received. I think Andy used the analogy of actually feeling love. And what I received, the wisdom or the knowledge that I received in the LBL was on different levels, which I found really hard to verbalize. There was a certain understanding I could verbalize, but there were other levels of meaning within that were actually very difficult to put into words, so I knew exactly what they meant. So, coming away from the LBL experience, it brought so much peace, calmness, and a complete change of perspective on my current life. And Andy, you used the analogy, didn't you, of reading about love and feeling love and the difference. And one of the things I experienced in the LBL was when I got my knowing, my understanding, it was actually more than that. It was an understanding on so many different levels. And to some extent, you can verbalize some of that understanding and what you're receiving. But the other levels, I would say, are almost impossible to put into words, yet they're being felt at such a deep level. So what you get from an LBL, for me, is different to anything else you get from any other form of regression, I suppose because you're going in at such a deep soul level. And that, for me, has given me such a different perspective and understanding. It's brought a lot of calmness and peace into my life. So, yes, it's an incredibly deep experience. I don't think really there's anything comparable.
No. So, Andy, how did LBL regression come about?
Well, it really started about 20 years ago, and there was a number of pioneers of past life regression who quite independently discovered soul memories between lives. And quite a few of them did it with giving imprecise commands, a little bit like the story that I mentioned before about the client who went beyond a past life death and then just continued. And they wrote about it, and this includes people like Wharton, Dolores Cannon, and probably the most famous of them is Michael Newton. Michael is probably the most famous one because he worked with a number of thousands of people with a life between life regression and then wrote 2 books on the subject. which have inspired an awful lot of people. Journey of the Soul is probably the most widely read book that Michael has published.
Right. And you also teach Life Between Life regression, do you not, as part of your training program?
Yes, that's right. And the way that I teach it is, I mean, I originally worked with Michael Newton in the early days, and when I started to establish my own training with Life Between Life regression, it was really to allow more therapists to go out and spread this work right across the globe because it's so incredibly powerful. You know, one of the things that is quite amazing now, because I've trained therapists in just about all of the countries of the world, is that no matter what beliefs people have, whatever religious backgrounds that they have, there's a consistency of the story. In fact, the book that I wrote on it, called Exploring the Eternal Soul, worked with 15 subjects and then talks about their story of their life between life and what happened to them. But I also link it to all of the pioneers and the books that they wrote, just to demonstrate how the consistency of all the major parts of the life between life. You know, and now over 10,000 people worldwide have had this experience.
So what are the consistent parts in the Life Between Life experience then?
Well, the first part is the death, where people are able to leave the physical body. And this is because our consciousness isn't actually in the physical body, it's actually in the energy field we have around us. And when the physical body is dead, people are able to experience looking down at the body, perhaps being aware of loved ones around the body, a little similar to near-death experiences where people report that consciousness is able to be detached from the physical body. And if people are crying, you know, there may be a reluctance to leave the physical body and to try to comfort and to perhaps try to send a message of some sort to those relatives who are distressed at the person's death. But at some point, the soul will be ready to continue the journey. They feel like a pull or a tug or just like a knowing. And as they start to leave the physical world and enter in the dimension that our souls reside in, they're often met by perhaps people from the past life, or maybe a spirit guide. A spirit guide is an evolved soul who will have been overseeing the past life and may have been helping and assisting in various ways during the past life. And then there's a period of what's called energy healing. And when souls leave the physical body, they may have left the physical sensations of pain behind, but they're still carrying the emotional charges from the life. So through a past life review and through energy healing, the vibration of the soul increases to the point where they're able to then operate purely as a soul at their own natural vibration. And then that's often when they join souls that they will have worked with over many, many lifetimes before. And these are referred to as soul groups. So quite often family members or people that have helped us in some way in our life, or maybe the perpetrators, people that have done something particularly unpleasant to us, may be part of that soul group. And this happened to be an agreement that had taken place before the life to play that role. And then a large part of the life between life is preparing for the next life and the planning and the activities that go with that. And it may be slightly easier to illustrate the life between life process with a client who came to me from Canada, and her husband had died, and she had the need to just find out more about why it had happened, and was feeling a little spiritual stuck. And when she came into the Life Between Life, when she went through the death, the past life had been about having a husband who had gone off to war, who'd been killed, and she'd found that she really couldn't continue with the life. She found it very difficult to engage in relationships with other people, and eventually gave up on life and died, which is a little bit like a form of suicide. And when she had gone through the death experiences, reunited with a spirit guide, she was describing how the spirit guide showed himself as a person with his arms crossed, saying, "This is the third time it's happened now, isn't it?" Meaning that there'd been 3 times where she'd lost a loved one and hadn't been able to cope and had given up on life. And there wasn't any judgment on high. It was almost like, well, let's just go through and review that life and see what the options are. And the spirit guide showed her how on 2 or 3 occasions after her husband had died, people had come into her life that she could have actually engaged into a relationship that would have developed into a personal relationship if she'd have chosen to. And then her life could have been totally different. So there was no way of saying you did right or you did wrong. This is about just showing what happened, what the choices were, and how things could have been different. And that's probably as far as judgment on high goes to in the Life Between Life, which is totally different than how some religions would have us believe, where we're either put down into the fires of damnation or we find salvation. That definitely doesn't happen. There's absolutely no judgment at a soul level. No soul ever judges another soul. They respect the free will that soul has and the decisions that it makes. But there's consequences. And then as soon as that client at a soul level had discovered the consequences of the decision, she reported going through to a soul group and meeting the soul of the person that had been the husband in that past life. And they started to discuss the next life and how they would help her through this particular problem that she had of giving up when people die. And the other soul that had also been the husband in 2 other lives with her, they were discussing different ways in which that could be done. Perhaps they could change sex, or perhaps it could be done at an earlier part of the life or a later part of the life. And then they came up with the idea of saying, well, look, perhaps if we're both quite independent and we have that independence before we meet, so we'll plan to have the next life where we have that independence so that when the husband dies, it's a lot easier then for the client, who would be the wife, to get through that. And of course, the
Andy,
husband who
this
had
is
died,
really fascinating. Maybe what we could do is come back to it after the break.
Healing the Eternal Soul is a book sprinkled with case examples that makes it an invaluable resource for those who assist others in achieving contact with their eternal part. It lends hope to those whose lives are stuck or riddled with painful residuals from past lives. More so, it's an incredibly interesting read.
The Past Life Regression Academy teaches hypnosis, past life regression, regression therapy, and Life Between Lives regression internationally. Hundreds of students have been through the Academy training program and have successful practices. This is because of the amazing results they get and the referrals that come from it. For more information, see the Regression Academy website.
Welcome back. We're just going to join Andy, who will continue on with his case study. It's a very fascinating case study. Andy.
Yes, we'd got to the point where the two souls had agreed what they were going to do for the client's current life, that she would incarnate as a woman, that her husband would incarnate with her, and they would both be independent. And two of the other souls agreed to be the children. And then I asked what the other souls would be gaining out of it, because obviously as a soul she could gain out of trying to get through this particular difficulty she had of losing a loved one. And it turned out what her husband wanted to work with at a soul level was patience, that he'd had a number of lifetimes where he hadn't been able to show patience. So they agreed that there would be some business opportunities coming into his life, and the role of the client was to slow her husband down from making decisions so that businesses would be successful. And if he ignored her advice and rushed into it, then the business would be unsuccessful. And the children would be gaining about learning how to cope with grief. So all of them in this, or you can almost call it a soul contract amongst a soul group, had something that they wanted to learn out of it. And then they incarnated. Now, with the client, although she'd planned it at a high level, there was a lot of details that were needed. And it was discussed with a spirit guide so that the spirit guide would agree, which they did, that this was a plan that made sense. But a very important part of these life between life stories is about seeking the wisdom of spirits of light that don't need to incarnate anymore, that can sometimes get a different perspective and offer a different level of advice. And these groups of spirits have got a variety of names. Sometimes they're called elders, sometimes they're called a council of elders, sometimes they can be called wise ones or higher ones. It doesn't really matter what their name are, but they're souls that work together in a group. I mean, the analogy is almost like someone at school, and the spirit guide is a little bit like the teacher of the class. And if they're perhaps at university, all the professors gathered together would be a little bit like the elders, if I can use that term. And when the plans were reviewed by the elders, they suggested two things needed changing. The first thing was the amount of soul energy that the client would bring into incarnation. This is probably worth just explaining to make it clear that the soul splits and some of the soul energy incarnates and some of it stays in the higher realms. So there's almost like a multi-dimensional experience can occur. If a lot of soul energy is brought down, it makes the life a lot easier. If very little soul energy is brought down, intuitive links are very difficult and the challenges are a lot harder. So they made suggestions about the level of soul energy that would make it easier for her to achieve the plan. And the other piece of advice was that she needed to have some spiritual inspiration after the husband had died, which was in the form of a life between life regression, not necessarily by me, but by someone who had those skills. And as a soul, she agreed to that. It is worth pointing out that everything works by free will. In this case, it was the soul's free will, whether to come down and to have that sort of life again. It was their free will, whether to accept the advice they were given. But they did do, and then that formed the basis of the current life that the client had had. But I did one last thing after the whole of the life between life experience had occurred is I asked the client to go back to the meeting with the elders, and instead of it being a narrative and a story of what happened, I switched it into a real life discussion, which is referred to as the eternal now, so that she was able to channel information from the elders, and I was able to ask additional information around some of the particular topics that this particular client had asked for that hadn't come out during the Life Between Life experience. And of course, when it had finished, the most important thing is it actually helped her engage in life. She eventually found another person to marry, and she'd been able to work through that very difficult situation of losing her husband, of losing a loved one, and been able to engage in life in a meaningful way.
Interesting. My next question is going to be maybe one from the skeptics, because, you know, if you sat and told your John Smith down the road that, you know, we're doing sessions where you go and meet the elders and spirit guides and clearing energies, they might just sit there and think, well, possibly the client is going into a place of fantasy. So my question is, are life between lives real? And how do you know if it's real? So maybe even Jay, you could explain how you knew that the experience was not made up by your psyche.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier to Andy about the level of knowing, that it's not just a knowing that you can explain, but it's so much deeper. And within that knowing, there's deep understanding. Things become very clear, even though they can't be put into words. And it's something you don't experience when you normally fantasize or make something up. So it really is a completely different level of knowing that, for me, that I received within the LBL. And it's not something I've ever experienced at any other time to that extent. So it was very clear to me that I was receiving something on a much deeper level that wasn't fantasy as far as I was concerned.
The other things that people really talk about is, first of all, that they are in very, very deep levels of hypnosis, where the conscious mind isn't, although it's aware, it's almost like very lazily in the background, so that it's not actually involved in doing things, that the story emerges often in a surprise for itself. I mean, for example, in the book I wrote, Exploring the Eternal Soul, I talk about some of the subjects there who'd had and read quite extensively about life between lives before, yet they found there were subtle aspects that were totally different than what they'd expected, and it had emerged in a way that was meaningful for them. You know, I mean, for example, sometimes when souls meet their soul group, they just feel the unconditional love from them all. I've even had clients where there's tears of joy come down their cheeks when they're in this very special spiritual space. But ultimately, it's down to each client to make up their own mind. Life Between Life therapists just simply ask the questions that manage the process. They say questions like, what happens next? Describe what's happening. What's communicated to you? So they don't force anything. They just allow the process to happen in a very natural, authentic way.
And going back to your book, Andy, Exploring the Eternal Soul, it was somewhat research, wasn't it, about this area? How did this project come about?
Well, it started with a colleague of mine who's written a number of other spiritual books called Ian Lawton. And the two of us decided we would try to do something a little different. There had been, obviously, with the books by Michael Newton and Witten and Dolores Cannon, books that had been written about the life between life. And we thought, well, look, let's do something completely different that would add another dimension to this whole area. So the approach that we took was twofold, because we, through this research, produced two books. And the book we've been talking about, Exploring the Eternal Soul, worked with 15 subjects, and 5 of those had past life experiences, or they'd read about past lives before. 5 of them had read about past life material, but it had been a number of years ago and they'd forgotten a lot about it. And 5 of them had never even read anything about it. And the book followed their stories all of the way through, and then how they found the experience afterwards. And then I was able to relate the key aspects, things like soul groups, meeting spirit guides, meeting elders, and so on. Although everybody's story will be different, the major events were consistent. And I was able to demonstrate through the book how that linked in to what all the other pioneers had found. So in a way, it meant that collectively over the thousands of people that have had life between life therapy, with hundreds of life between life therapies, a consistency of approach, which probably makes this the largest piece of spiritual research that's ever taken place. So that was the first part. The second part of the research is a book that Ian Lawton wrote himself out of that research, called The Wisdom of the Soul. And how that worked is, as I mentioned before, with the client who'd committed suicide in the past life, how I went back to the elders and asked a few questions. We decided what we would do would be to ask a whole series of questions on a wide range of topics and take a client who'd had a particularly good life between life experience, very detailed, that had very deep levels of trance, but go straight to the meeting with the elders and ask them these questions and see what their answers were. And we would do that with 9 other subjects. So then we could compare the results of 10 people through 10 groups of elders to see whether their answers on those topics was consistent. Because we were a little concerned, although there's some amazing information that's channeled, one's never too sure whether there's conscious mind interference taking place or how evolved the source of that information is. But we knew in this case, because of the process, we would be talking to the most evolved spirits of light that communicate to humans. And we knew that the clients would be in very, very deep levels of hypnosis while it happened.
Mm. So from your experience, what are the 3 most interesting points that came out through your research and through your book that the audience members would like to hear?
Well, the first that I found particularly interesting, I mean, I've worked with spirit attachments. These are souls that don't go on the journey we've been talking about and remain earthbound and attach themselves to people. And it's a very controversial subject. A number of people take the view that there's no such thing. Even, for example, Michael Newton has said that he doesn't know of any of his clients that have said, I've got a spirit attachment with me. So I thought, well, although I've been working this area and I've helped countless people by removing spirit attachments, or at least what appear to be spirit attachments, and they've had amazing transformations of symptoms, perhaps we'll ask the elders what their views are on it. And of course, they confirmed that spirit attachments or disconnect spirits can attach themselves to people. And they went on to explain that in the transition after leaving the death point, as the soul goes for energy healing, then any spirit attachments are taken off automatically, and the client wouldn't even know. They just experiencing a healing, an expansion of their energy body. So it's a thing that happens without them consciously knowing that it occurs. Hence the reason of why it was never reported by Michael Newton. So for me, this is the first piece of research that has at least attempted to untangle this knot. Is there such a thing as a spirit attachment? The second area that I found quite interesting was about the nature of time. There's lots of various theories around this suggesting that because when we don't have a physical body and we're in the spiritual dimensions, that time is experienced completely different, and that the notion that we have of time of, for example, a past life, then having a life between life experience, and another past life, a life between life experience, and then our current life, and then the future being something that hasn't been decided yet. This is how a lot of people think of time. But there's been people that have suggested that maybe time works in parallel. Maybe past lives can even happen at the same time you're experiencing our current life. So we asked the elders what their views were with it, and they said, of course, time is experienced differently in a human body, but it is all designed for us to think of events in this logical, sequential way. If you try to think of it any other way, it just really won't be helpful. So again, they just confirmed the nature of time. When in a physical body, just think of time through the way in which traditional science would describe it. And the third area that I found quite fascinating, we asked the question to the elders, what do they think is the single most difficult challenge facing the world? Now, we were expecting...
And maybe what we could do is just reveal that answer after the break. So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
Have you ever wondered what happens after death? Deep hypnosis opens up the most amazing soul memories of a spirit world that awaits us all. Follow the fascinating journey of 15 ordinary people in the book Exploring the Eternal Soul, who have been regressed beyond a past life into the afterlife.
The Past Life Regression Academy teaches hypnosis, past life regression, regression therapy, and life between lives regression internationally. Hundreds of students have been through the Academy training program and have successful practices. This is because of the amazing results they get and the referrals that come from it. For more information, see the Regression Academy website.
Welcome back. We are joined by Andy and Jay, and Andy was going to reveal what is the greatest problem that we're facing in the world at the moment. Andy.
Well, I was quite surprised because I was expecting something like perhaps pollution or the threat of nuclear explosion or terrorism. But the answer they said was the delay in people waking up to who they really are. And what they meant by that is a number of souls have come down in incarnation at this particular moment of time in a human body, in the life situation where they were, with a commitment to wake up to spiritually who they are. And when they are aware of that, then the way of treating the world will be totally different. You know, I mean, I'll just give you a little analogy of someone who I give a past life to. It was an Orthodox Jew who had a big dislike for Arabs. When they went into a past life, they turned out to be an Arab. And then when they came out of the past life, all of a sudden they found it hard to hate the person who they'd been in a past life. In other words, becoming spiritually aware enables us to realize that we're all souls, we're all equal, we're all down here to learn something new. And it treats us to behave in a totally different way than a materialistic way does. So this aspect of people waking up to who they are was their biggest challenge. So anybody that engages in any activity that does that are taking a step in helping to achieve this biggest challenge to humanity at the moment.
It's sounding to me that when you take someone to the eternal now, when you're speaking to the evolved spirits of light, it sounds very similar to someone going and getting information channeled to them. So my question is, how is this different to just channeled information?
Well, to some extent, there is a similarity because when I do this work, the elders talk to the person rather than being a three-way discussion. So that, for example, when I ask a question, the client will respond with the words of, we think this or we think that, because these are the words of the elders that are answering the question. So in that sense, it's a little bit like trance mediumship. But the two major differences are that the person is in deep trance, so that we know there's going to be minimum conscious mind interference. And the second is that we know that we've tuned to highly evolved spirits of light because we had that connection in the life between life process. So I think those are two of the major things. And we even asked the questions in the research to the elders, and we said, look, how can we know that even with this work, there isn't conscious mind interference? And they said to us, well, with one of your subjects, you will find some conscious mind interference. It's for you to find out. Listen to the words and just feel it. And we actually had 11 subjects. And when we went through and recorded it, it was obvious. You could just feel the difference in response. So we took away that 11th person, and then we just went with the 10 that we did.
What was the feel?
I think in some senses there's similarities, but when the client is experiencing it, they will experience it in a completely different way.
I was going to ask, what was the feel? What was different about the 11th subject?
Well, there was terminology. I mean, for example, I mentioned how when the elders were doing it, they were saying things like, we think this, we think that. Whereas when this other client was saying it, she wasn't using that terminology. But there was also like an intuitive knowing. You could just feel that there was something not genuine about it. It's like if someone is telling you a story and they're not being truthful, you have that knowing. And when someone is being really honest, you just know it's honest, it's true. So there's like that sense of knowing. So the listener really needs to be very careful. So, we did that process for the readers of the book by filtering out anything where there was obviously conscious mind interference. And we did another thing, by the way, also. We talked to all the subjects afterwards and asked them whether any of the information that came through was something that they knew about. I mean, they didn't know what the questions were before they came. And with the subject that we removed, she said, oh yeah, I had a lot of information in that area and it was very consistent to what I thought. So again, there was little clues about that. Whereas with a lot of other subjects, they were getting information that was totally new to them, ways of describing things that were completely different.
And Jay, have you had any channeled information given to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've had channeled information given to me by someone else who channeled.
And what was
I've
the difference
had
in the experience?
coming through with people in LBLs, which have been channeled from wise ones. And there is definitely a difference. And also, when you're in that experience of an LBL and that information is coming through in a channeled way, there's a different feeling to it. There's feelings with the words and what's coming through that give it a very different quality. And as Andy said, obviously, when you're listening to channeled information from someone else being given to you, you're in a different state of conscious awareness to when you're receiving channeled information in a deep trance state. So there really is very much a difference in the feeling. And I think, Andy, you just said as well about trusting how you feel when you receive, when you're hearing channeled information through someone else. You very much, in the LBL, I find, as a therapist, listening to someone channeling an elder or a wise one, or whatever terminology you use, you feel very much the energy of those wise ones or elders coming through with what's being channeled, and that for me is very much a clue as to the origin and the quality of what's being received and what's being channeled.
So what is the benefit of going through an LBL experience to receive channeled information versus just going and seeing a psychic and receiving channeled information?
What people can do, I think really it's not so much we did this work for the purpose of the book because we wanted to bring out more unusual aspects of the spiritual world that wouldn't normally come out in a life between life. Things like one cell's finish incarnating, what do they do in the spirit realms? So we're able to discover a lot of information in there, but most of the work that we have or we do is allowing people to experience their life between life. And when people experience their own, this is a completely different type of experience rather than being told things from a psychic. And it's almost the analogy that I was talking to you about before. It's the difference between reading about a book on love or experiencing romance yourself. There's a completely different nature about it. And people will connect energetically in an amazing way. There is actually another benefit of having a life between life, and that is that once people are able to get this energetic connection, they're able in the meditation to tune in and make connection with the spirit guide or with the elders and ask them other information. So energetically, there's a big shift and a big change in the person.
Okay. So, Andy, where can people get information about getting life between life sessions or even getting in touch with responsible life between life therapists?
Well, it is important that they've been through professional training. And if people want to go onto the website of people that have been trained by the academy that I run, the website is called www.regressionacademy.com. Or they can, Michael Newton does training, and there's the Newton Institute where they have life between life therapists on that. Either one of them would have people that are professionally trained that would be able to do this work for them. The one thing, though, that people would benefit more if they went onto the website for the therapists that have been trained by the academy is that I found quite often before people have the life between life regression, they need to really clear emotional issues or even spirit attachments from them. And the therapists that have been trained by the academy are able to do that much deeper and much more professionally because that's part of their treatment. So there'd be almost a journey where the life between life information is part of the journey and the clearing of emotional issues is an equally important part.
Got it. Okay. And Jay, you yourself, you're a life between life therapist, are you not?
Oh yes, very privileged to be trained by Andy,
So,
I might add.
in your experience,
Thank
what
you,
is the
Andy.
most interesting experience that a client has told you about during their experience?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? Sorry.
As being a life between life therapist, what is the most interesting thing that one of your clients has experienced in their session?
Recently in a life between life, I had a client who was explaining about the point in the LBL where just before they reincarnate and to come into the current life body, they were just going to go into the fetus at the moment that the parents had intercourse and the fetus was created, that the sperm and the egg joined, and they went down and joined with the cells and the energy at that point, and then came back into the LBL space. It was something I've not come across before, but it's amazing that they almost went to dip a toe in at that moment when the physical body was being created on the earth. And then they came back to the LBL space to carry on their preparation work for the next lifetime.
And what was the purpose of dipping their toe in?
They had to go in and just to feel the energy at that point, because it was like an energy imprint for them that moment that the energy was created, and they needed to be there to experience that.
So do all life between life sessions enable the client to feel what it was like when they merged with the body of the baby?
It can be a part of the life between life experience if it's appropriate for the person. It depends how the session flows, but generally for most LBLs, you can take them through the point where they leave the spirit realms and actually move into the point where they're entering the physical body for the current lifetime. And it's usually quite a surprising process for a lot of people, feeling the difference in the feeling of coming into the physical body. It's usually the reverse of moving into the LBL space, in which case they feel their energy expanding, the heaviness of the third dimension and the body moving, dropping away, coming into the life. They actually feel like it's almost like putting an overcoat on and coming into quite a restricted space. But that can be a part of the experience for people. It's a very interesting part.
I'm just wondering whether all souls who, in your experience with all the clients you've seen, whether all souls move from a human existence into an LBL state to this human existence, or whether you've had souls or clients who've experienced moving into the LBL state from maybe an otherworldly type experience.
Yes, I have actually. There's been times where I've worked with clients whose last lifetime hasn't actually been a human lifetime. And they've actually come into the current lifetime from a different dimension. They've had to use the LBL state initially from a past life to move into this one. It's a very interesting process when you work that way, because obviously you don't have the regular structure of a full LBL journey that we have with a lot of clients moving from their last past life into the current lifetime. I've recently worked with a client whose soul energy originates from another dimension, not the dimension of our universe, but from a dimension where they're actually an energy wave, just an energy wave. And in that instance used music, the resonance of sound vibration, to take them home into that space to experience that.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And it probably would have helped explain quite a lot of their current life, having this particular knowledge, didn't it?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who have the awareness, become aware that their soul energy doesn't originate in our physical universe, they often find they have problems in the current lifetime, sometimes in the human body. They have problems sometimes interacting with people. So it explains a lot for people when they get the understanding sometimes that their soul doesn't originate in our dimension.
Interesting. So, Andy, what would you tell somebody who is considering coming for a Life Between Life session?
Well, what I would normally say to them is if they're in the middle of some emotionally challenging times, to work through those first of all. Regression therapy can be very helpful for them to do that. And then if they want to discover a deeper aspect about themselves, if they want to really start to open themselves up spiritually, engage themselves in a more meaningful way in the world, then a Life Between Life regression is a really great way to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Andy and Jay, for coming on this program.
Okay, thank you, Rena.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. For more information on Andy Tomlinson, please visit regressionacademy.com or regressionassociation.com. For more information on Jay, please go to 10treestherapies.com. And for more information on me, please go to divineaspect.com.
Healing the Eternal Soul is a book sprinkled with case examples that makes it an invaluable resource for those who assist others in achieving contact with their eternal part. It lends hope to those whose lives are stuck or riddled with painful residuals from past lives. More so, it's an incredibly interesting read.